this isn't anything that just is limited to the United States. It's a worldwide phenomenon.
Hi everyone and welcome to KGRA Digital Broadcasting. Our interview with Graeme Rendall kicks off the show this week. Graeme is an author, researcher and also one of my friends and colleagues from UAP Media UK. Graeme, welcome to the show.
Hello Andy, it's good to be here, thanks.
Fantastic. Almost like we're doing this for the very first time, isn't it? And listen, we're making a bit of a change and special treatment for you this week, Graeme. You are kicking off the show. Dan will be joining us after this interview and we'll break that down a little bit as well. Graeme, you have released a very popular book in the last couple of weeks online. I'm going to hold up a copy of it here. For those that may or may not have seen, we have this absolute beauty. Look at the weight to that as well. I like a weighty book. We have UFOs before Roswell, European Foo Fighters 1940 to 1945. You've got the foreword there by the wonderful Mr. Sean Cahill as well. Graeme, before we get to discussing the book, tell us a little bit about yourself and your interest in UFOs.
Yeah, so I've been an aircraft enthusiast for about the last 45 years, maybe even 50 years, getting on for now. My mum used to buy me airfix kits of model aircraft when I was really young, just to keep me quiet, and my interest in aircraft went on from there. I also had an interest in science fiction from an early age. I got a UFO book because my mum thought it was a science fiction book. It turned out to be fact, obviously. So that's how I got kickstarted into the world of UFOs. And at the same time, I was also interested in World War II as well. So I got an interest in German secret weapons. All those three things came together with this book.
And we discussed recently on one of our road trips to Preston, your travels that you've been on, and one of your previous books was based all around Siberia, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. The first book I wrote back in February this year, or the first one I released rather, it was about my travels around northeastern Siberia in June and July 1992. So this was 6 months after the fall of the Soviet Union. And it was a very, very strange time when you could get round by bribing people, basically, dodging bureaucracy and all the rest of it. So I spent a few weeks going around a strange part of Russia, taking pictures of very, very unusual aircraft and very, very unusual polar settlements.
Well, hopefully that'll explain a little bit of why you've chosen to write a book based on events that happened now 80 years ago. And that's a lot of information for events that are so old, essentially now, given we're looking at so many events like the Tic Tac for 2004 and obviously Nimitz Princeton, there's the USS Omaha events and all this other stuff that's really modern. What's got you writing the book based on events from way back when?
I've always had this kind of fixation with why the modern ufology always seems to start in 1947. I used to read books back in the 70s and the 1980s where you would see the chronology of you would have the mystery airships in the 1890s, you'd have the ghost aircraft in the 1920s and 30s, and then they would just skip over World War II straight to the ghost rockets of 1946 and to Kenneth Arnold and Roswell in 1947. And there was always this period of time which I was really interested in, World War II, and it was well, where are the reports from there? There were lots of people around, lots of kind of detection equipment, radar, people just watching the skies. So why weren't they seeing things? Why aren't these things being recorded? So when I started to hear back then a few stories, that's really piqued my interest. And as time's gone on, I've found a few more, and then I got to the point where I just wanted to dig in and try and find stories which hadn't been told before. And that's where the books basically resulted from.
Why do you think that was? You mentioned going back to the late kind of 1800s, the mystery airships, and then obviously we had another world war just at the start of the 1900s. Why do you think there was that gap, that jump to Roswell, basically?
The gap basically stems from a kind of false assumption, if you like, that the Foo Fighters was only a very, very limited phenomenon. And it only appeared over a very short period of time and in very specific areas of Europe and the Pacific. And that's down to basically a magazine article that appeared in a Forces newspaper at the end of 1945. And it had a very small list of cases from one particular squadron based in France over the winter of 44-45. And that's mostly where, that was the sum total of the information on the Foo Fighters, plus a couple of cases from the Pacific and one during the day or the daytime raids over Germany. And that was it. for about 50 years, with the exception of maybe a couple of other cases. That was your sum total of knowledge on the Foo Fighters. So no wonder a lot of authors and researchers over that 50-year period from 45 up to 1995 just gave it a miss, basically, and just thought, well, it's not worth bothering with. We'll look at much more, sexy cases from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, because they demand our time. This is just something, that's not worth bothering with.
Was it a difficult time for anyone to identify anything anomalous potentially in the sky, given the sky itself was filled with German aircraft, Russian aircraft, US, American aircraft, all types of rockets and bombs going off? How does one of the time associate something like a UFO that could potentially just be some kind of German rocket?
So all aircrew, when they were going through their basic training, used to get aircraft recognition lessons. It was part of the ground lectures that they were giving you if they were going to be a pilot, or they were going to be a navigator or a gunner. It didn't matter who you were going to be in the air, you still got the same kind of knowledge. And then, of course, your experience was, you gained experience mission after mission after mission, provided you didn't get shot down or killed, of course. And after a few hours in the air, you got to know what was happening up there, so you could see the type of targeting flares that your own side used to mark targets over Germany, the different kind of green, white, yellow and red flares that they used. But the Germans used decoy ones as well, and they got to know what they looked like. And of course, night fighters, when they were seen by the gunners, they got to know fairly quickly what they looked like as well, because it was fairly obvious. An aircraft coming firing tracer rounds at you, it looked like an aircraft firing bullets at you, basically. And then, of course, there were all those other types of flares, decoys, and other things that were seen, that they did get to know what these things were. But also hand in hand with these were the things that didn't register, and they didn't look like flares, they didn't look like aircraft, they just didn't look like anything on Earth, basically. And these are the things that I talk about in the book.
Now, at the time, we're looking a time before Roswell, before the flying saucer flap. What was the general consensus when it came to UFOs, flying saucers from other planets?
So those words weren't in the lexicon in 1942, 1943, 44, 45. Those things were still 3 or 4 years in the future. Everything back then was the expectation that the Germans were going to introduce some kind of new secret weapon. And these kind of lights and these objects that were being seen, that's what they thought they were. And they had analysis, and they were doing lots of work behind the scenes to try and work out what these things were. But of course, they were doing that in other fields as well. So when they got to know about the V1 flying bomb and the V2 rocket, they were looking for information about those as well. And of course, about German jets and other types of aircraft and guns and ships, everything, anything you can think of. They were always looking for new information on these things before they were put into service. But these things were something different, because they didn't have anything tangible. They didn't have any bits. They didn't have any wreckage. Didn't have any intelligence reports from people in the field, from secret agents, people taking pictures of installations, and all the rest of it that happened with all these other things. This was something completely different, and that made it much more difficult for them to try and work out what was going on.
Now, I'm lucky I've got my copy of the book, obviously. I have seen you do a fantastic presentation recently at the Minicon in Preston, where you went through lots of various aspects of the book and why you came to some of the conclusions you did. Are there any standout cases you could discuss? Not without going into too much detail, I don't want you to spoil the book for people, but any particular favourite cases from the book?
Yeah, I mean, the front cover, which is expertly designed by Dan Zetterstrom, your colleague, and also Olaf Rockner in Sweden, that's the one there that you're showing there. The Wellington bomber. This is a March 1942 case. So we're setting the timetable like two and a half years before what was the accepted wisdom for the start of the Foo Fighters, which is the end of 1944. Now, this was actually a bombing raid to Essen in Germany, and the aircraft was coming back. It was a Polish crewed Wellington bomber from the Royal Air Force. And this copper-colored disc kind of light came up behind them. The rear gunner was told to open fire on it because they thought it was a German night fighter. But the bullets went into this thing and nothing happened. It wasn't shot down, it wasn't damaged, it didn't catch fire. It just sat there and absorbed the bullets, for want of a better phrase, because it didn't do anything. And then after a little while, it flew around to the wingtip of the aircraft, of this twin engine bomber, and sat there for a bit. as they were flying along. And of course, at that point, the nose gunner could actually open fire on it as well. So at one stage, the two turrets, the tail turret and the nose turret, were actually opening fire on this light, again to no avail. Then it moved round to a position in front of the bomber and just sat there as the bomber was flying through the sky. Maintaining station a few hundred feet or yards off the nose. And then after a while, it just shot off into the distance and never seen again. The crew behind the aircraft concerned had also seen this light, but they didn't want to report it. And of course, when they got back to base, this particular crew, when they tried to report it to the intelligence officers, they were asked, "Were you drinking?" Because that was a standard, sort of reply to when people said, "I've seen something anomalous."
Now, do you think all of these events were linked? When we say the Foo Fighters, we're just describing anomalous lights in the sky that had a range of various movements and behaviours that you wouldn't associate with a normal aircraft of the time. Do you think we were seeing one and the same thing spread over various different countries, or are we seeing a range of phenomena?
There's certainly a range involved because the lights are only a very small part of the overall, strangeness that happened during World War II. If you look at a lot of the sightings during the day that involved the American bomber crews flying over Germany, they were reporting things that were called swarms of bees or cotton wool balls and some other really strange things, which I go into in detail in the book. But that's all based on intelligence reports, things that were actually quoted in official reports that went up the chain of command. But then you go to places like Russia, and there was a case about something that looked like what was described as an upturned bathtub. So there's a whole kind of range of things involved, different sizes. There were aerial torpedoes that were 200 foot long. They were described with portholes along the side, and that's another case. So you name it, it's probably it's in there somewhere in terms of the list of sightings during World War II. So you're looking at a kind of microcosm of what happened for the next 50, 60, 70, 80 years, because all the things that happened afterwards, it was all shapes and sizes, colored lights, different types of objects, sizes, shapes. Well, that all happened during the war as well. So yeah, it's possibly the same thing. I can't say it is for definite, but if you look at it in the round, then it certainly seems to be that way.
I think it's a really interesting time, and some of the stuff I've picked up from the book, like you say, those different descriptions, it's from a place where, like you say, UFOs, flying saucers, flying discs weren't in the language, weren't in the lexicon, as you said. So it was very much down to the individual's interpretation of what they were seeing, which is where you can get all these weird and wonderful descriptions from. Like before there was the color blue, how would you describe blue? It would be open to, how you decided what it was. And I think that's what's really interesting, that a lot of these individuals didn't have that preconceived notion. There wasn't a lot of science fiction, was there, out and about for people to read and pick up, to put into their minds that, well, it's probably aliens or probably some sort of spacecraft. Is that fair to say?
It is, because if you chart the names that you use for this phenomenon, or the things that we're seeing, that actually changed over time as well. Because the original reports, when you see from about 1942, when they started doing analysis on the things that were following the aircraft at night, they were just called lights. And the RAF aircrew actually called them either the light or the thing. But then, as the war progressed and they started getting cases of things that were zigzagging through the skies and chasing aircraft, they became called rockets, because they were expecting the Germans to be fielding anti-aircraft rockets and other types of rockets. And then when they thought they were going to be fielding jets later on, which actually happened much later than the reports that I have in the book suggest, they started calling them mystery jets, and they started calling them specific types of jets, even though these jets hadn't been fielded by the Luftwaffe at the particular time these reports were being made. So you can chart the progress of the name, just how it changes through the years, and that's quite telling as well, because that shows that there's no preconceived idea. Oh, there must be aliens, they must be flying saucers. Again, these words weren't in their kind of like data set. It was just something that was going to happen in the future.
Those words now are in the data set, and with the benefit of 80 years of hindsight, Graeme, what do you think the Foo Fighters were?
I can't sit here and tell you that, Andy, because I have no idea. All I can sort of believe is that they were the exact same thing that people started seeing in the late 40s and onwards. I just think to say that the modern ufology started in 1947, I think that's possibly inaccurate. I think it started earlier, and these were maybe one of the earliest representations of the things that we're seeing even today, just over the last 80 years. So that's why I thought this book was important. It just shows people that 1947 wasn't the start of everything. It might have been like a milestone for a lot of people, but I think you should push that history a little bit further back by a few years at least, because there was a lot going on during the war.
And what do you think, Graeme, just to wrap up, the chances are some of the craft seen were secret weapons made more than likely by the Germans?
I've looked into that quite deeply in the book, and one of the aims in terms of the book was not only to give people an idea of the scale and the geographic and the time scale during the war about all these sightings, but was actually to knock on the head some of the kind of myths about what the Foo Fighters were. Because if you look at the internet and you read a lot of things, you'll see that they're written off as V1 flying bombs or V2 rockets or different types of German jet fighter or rocket fighter. Now, those can't have been the Foo Fighters for a variety of reasons, which I haven't got time to go into now, but if people read the book, you'll see the reasoning that I come up with. And it's usually down to geography and times, and just the fact that the Germans weren't actually as far forward with a lot of things like anti-aircraft rockets than a lot of people think they were. And sometimes people give the Germans too much credit for some of the secret weapons, because actually they had a lot of things that they designed, but putting them into practice was another thing entirely.
Well, Graeme, I think you've done a wonderful job in wrestling back the term Foo Fighter from a certain Mr. Dave Grohl. So if people want to go out and check UFOs before Roswell, European Foo Fighters, 1940 to 1945. And like I say, you get that wonderful foreword by Mr. Sean Cahill in there as well. Graeme, how can people follow you, and how can they get a hold of the book as well?
So my Twitter handle is @border750. There's a link tree reference in my profile, so you can see everything I do there. You can look to get to my website where you can see my book for sale. It's also on Amazon, so if you search my name, Graeme Rendall, on Amazon, you'll find it there. You'll also find the Siberian book there as well. So yeah, that's how you can get in touch with me.
Brilliant. Graeme, thanks for joining us. And folks, there is an extended interview for That UFO podcast that will be available round about a few days after this show airs on KGRA. So look for that from about the 25th, 26th of October, and that will be a longer form interview with Graeme, and we'll dive into a bit more detail on some of those cases. So Graeme, again, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Andy.
Welcome to the main portion of the show, everyone. We are on KGRA Digital Broadcasting. Hello to everyone in the chat, and I hope you've enjoyed that interview with the wonderful Graeme Rendall of UAP Media UK. Dan is joining me now. How are we doing, Dan?
I'm great, thank you very much.
Awesome. We won't say too much about Graeme's interview, because we have done a longer form interview also with Graeme for the main podcast. So you can check that out when it drops. It's already available on patreon.com/That UFO podcast, or you can subscribe to Apple Premium. If you're on Apple, go to the Apple Podcast Store, click. And I think you click. I'm not sure what I said. Click.
Tap.
Tap, click.
Tap.
Touch, press. And you can get a 2-week free trial of Apple Premium as well. So you get early access, ad-free listening, and some bonus content too. But Graeme was great to speak to. Please go and check out his book, UFOs Before Roswell. And it's based on those encounters of the Foo Fighters and UFOs between 1940 and 1945. Some really interesting stuff. Very well researched as well. That book is set, Dan, just before 1947. And as we know, Roswell happened. One of probably the most famous crash or reported crash of a UFO of all time. And it is Crash Retrieval Week. So we wanted to make sure, as part of Crash Retrieval Week, we were covering it as thoroughly as possible for the show. Our friend James Iandoli, who is well known for his podcast Engaging the Phenomenon and his YouTube channel, make sure you're checking that out.
And also Meta Perspective now as well, where he speaks to kind of, it's a bit more esoteric. So if you're a little bit more leaning towards the woo, I'd really recommend it.
Cool, yeah, and yep, he's definitely his new pod there too. He's just done his appearance on Unidentified Celebrity Review a couple of nights ago as well. So go back and check that out. And thanks to Luis, Michael, and Rather B, who were on just before us on KGRA. If you're catching this when it premieres as well. So yeah, Crash Retrieval Week was James's idea, just to get people talking, given all the nuggets that have been dropped into the news over the last couple of months. And Lou Elizondo's talked about it. You know, a few others have too. And it's just to kind of keep things fresh in people's mind. It's an incredibly interesting part of the conversation when it comes to this subject, and one that brings up a whole lot of different emotions. We were on Calling All Beings. Well, you didn't make it, Dan, but I was on with Dan Warren. I was on with James Iandoli, DJ from who hosts the podcast. Nathan was on there as well. And Luis Jimenez joined us too. And that was a really interesting format and discussion. But the best part for me was when we were talking about the Crash Retrieval stuff, because it really got everybody going. And there was a lot of disagreements and intense discussion. And where would materials be kept and why would we keep it secret? And DJ was adamant it must be still at Area 51. And some of us thought, no, surely it's been moved by now. But it was a really interesting discussion. And I was looking to just carry that forward. And I wanted to know, Dan, if you, first off, before we get to some of the listener questions, have you got any favourite known stories or lesser known stories potentially involving crash retrievals?
Yeah, absolutely. So one that's kind of near to home for me, Aberystwyth, 1983. Farmer Erwell Evan woke up in the morning, went outside and found all this debris strewn across his field. He assumed a plane had crashed, called the authorities, the RAF. They said that basically it wasn't anything of theirs. They came with some plainclothes officers, cleared it all up. A few weeks later, they went, Irwell and UFO investigator Gary Rowe went back out to the area where it happened and found some damaged trees. And amongst the damaged trees, they found a bunch of debris that was kind of structured like honeycomb, which now we'd kind of probably look at it and go, you know what, we make that kind of stuff. But back then, it didn't seem so prevalent out there. It has been tested and found that basically it wasn't anything that the RAF was using at the time. The Forestry Commission, after they sent this off for testing, they actually cut down that part of the forest, saying it was damaged in a storm, which I thought was a little interesting. And then later on, investigator Gary Rowe, who had the material, and he keeps it under lock and key. So, you know, if you wanted to see it, you contact him and he arranges for it to be brought to the house. But what he actually did was cut up a bunch of the material and made key rings out of it that are kind of like these little circles that say the Welsh Roswell. And he gave them out at UFO conventions. And he says that at one point he was visited by the Men in Black, we'll say, who asked for the debris. And he, you know, like a brave soul that he is, told them, I've actually already sent it out to people. And if you don't stop bothering me, I'm going to tell them all to go to the press. And that's kind of where the story stops. He still has the material. It, like I said, it was tested. It was nothing they were using at the time. And like many things, it's an unknown. You can see the material in an interview on YouTube. If you search for Gary Rowe and Sufon, there is an interview there. I'd recommend people do that. But yeah, it's a lesser known one from the Welsh mid Wales.
And I know for a fact, Dan, you told me you want a hold of one of those key rings. So if anyone listening knows, or I mean, if you have one you want to gift to Dan, or, you know, if you have found one on eBay or anything like that, give Dan a shout and he'll go bidding on it, because he's really, really keen to get a hold of something.
Please
like that.
do. I'd love to get it, and I'd love to, you know, use some of the people that we've been lucky enough to talk to over the past year or so, and maybe get it looked at again. I think that would be great.
Dan, you mentioned the honeycomb matrix shape. What is the big deal with this? Because this is something that comes up more and more, and I've not only seen this honeycomb structure talked about in terms of physical material, but when I've read or watched some interviews that you've kind of sent my way, or stuff you've talked about and have more of an interest in, where you even talk about the fabric of our reality and, you know, space time and all that kind of stuff, you start to see this honeycomb structure come up more and more. What is the deal with that? If you can enlighten me a little bit.
I mean, honeycomb, the shape of it is just a very strong shape. You know, obviously bees use it for their hives, and there's a reason to that. You know, there's not a lot of material there, but it's structurally very strong. So it means you could use it for something like aircraft, and it's light and strong, so the plane can float a little better, basically. in terms of it kind of becoming a prevalent shape as you go down the fractals to the the bottom of our universe, that's a really interesting point, and no one really knows why those kind of things are there. But it's definitely worth kind of pointing out and keeping an eye on that this is a shape that shows up in nature a lot. And if you want kind of just one more where it shows up, the at the top of Jupiter, I want to say there's a big storm
yeah.
that's
Yep.
actually a hexagon shape again. So we're talking fractals. That's obviously much bigger than a beehive, and you can kind of go down as well. It's super interesting.
No, that's really cool. And my favorite crash story is Roswell. There's just nothing else. I remember watching movies when I was a kid growing up. There's that the famous Roswell movie. I've seen the documentaries on it, and I think the story's still fascinating. I think it's one that there's not a whole lot of digging to be done with it anymore, in terms of that most of the witnesses have long passed on, many of them, and you're talking to the grandkids of people who were involved now, who again are considerably aged as well. There's not a whole lot, I think, to add to that story. I think the real big next steps on that story would be some kind of official confirmation, if we ever did get that something did crash. I know Luis Elizondo shared his personal belief on with Thomas Hessler, I believe it was, last night on their podcast, that, again, he stressed just his personal belief, no official confirmation, which you could read into that what you will, given what his job was and the
People
people he
already
worked with.
are, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That he thinks Roswell 100% happened. Now, that doesn't say that Roswell was 100% an alien craft that
Absolutely.
crashed. That just says that something crashed that wasn't the property of the US government, and it was recovered. Again, from there, the story can go off in a whole load of different ways. And we'll kind of come back to that with the footage review we do right at the end today as well.
Do you think, can I ask you, do you think if Roswell happened now, with Twitter and Facebook and everything like that out there, do you think that Jesse Marcel would have just posted pictures straight away to the internet? All the people that kind of came across this debris, would it have gone on Facebook first? Hey, anyone know what this is? And do you think it would have broken this secret wide open if it happened these days?
It's a hard one, because the context of the question, like, I think what happened at the time was it was one of the first, and the US military didn't know how to deal with it, which is why we got that press release out straight away that they had captured a flying saucer, which then was very quickly corrected to no, just a weather balloon, because they didn't know what else to do or what else to say. There didn't seem to be protocols for it put in place. I suppose, are you talking that if it happened now, it would be the first time it had ever happened?
Yeah, I guess in this scenario, yeah, for sure.
Because that makes a whole lot of difference. If you're going to, even let's just say we had the technology now, that back then, that we have now, so Twitter, internet, all that kind of stuff, I think you would have saw it very quickly being shut down, because I think you just have to take all things considered that there would be enough control mechanisms put in place that we were more sophisticated than things were back then, that probably wouldn't have gotten out. And even let's flip that and say it happened now anyway. You look at the Magé incident from last year, where there were reports that something crashed in the forest in Brazil, in a small town, Magé, and there were reports of beings being shot. There were loud explosions. The US military apparently turned up, a lot of helicopters in the area. And again, it was all very quickly shut down. So one, you could look at it and go, maybe it was just a whole lot of nothing blown out of proportion. Or is that just a really good example of how quickly something like that can now be cleaned up and moved on?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I remember as well, around that Magé crash, there were a few videos put out rather quickly that were like, oh, I've taken a video of the saucer, and they were completely fake. It was like a plate kind of dug into the ground and shot in a certain way to make it look, so it makes you wonder. It sounds kind of conspiracy theory-ish, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge that these companies and power structures exist that could very easily do this.
I think it could go out now, and most people wouldn't believe it anyway. It goes back to that same thing we've talked about a few times now, that what does real look like? So what would a crashed, and we've seen the clear footage of the saucer stuck in the ground, but it's from the X-Files season 10 opener.
Yeah.
But if something like that went online, it would just be, it's from a movie, it's CGI, it's fake, someone put it there. That's it. That's all people have to do. And there's enough doubt because why would it be real? So it would be so hard to get that official confirmation unless it happens somewhere really built up, somewhere in London, somewhere in New York, Chicago, a really, really populated area. So it's a hard one. But Dan,
Did you just to touch on that?
Go on.
Lou gave a really good example. He said that when he was briefing people on the gimbal video, he would show them a certain video of the Apollo 11 capsule, because of the way it moved, and it moves in a really kind of janky way, obviously because it's in the vacuum of space, and they're kind of using those thrusters to make it move that way. But I'd recommend people watch it. We'll put a link in the description, because imagine something moving like that in our atmosphere, and you're right, it just looks fake.
Yeah, if you bring in a bubble around some kind of craft that creates that vacuum of space potentially all around it, like you say, that's why these things would tilt and move and be able to perform right angle turns and all that other kind of stuff as well. So yeah, that was really interesting point. And I think I shared that video on Twitter today, which is no longer today when people watch this. People could be watching this in thousands of years. Again, hello to the future. I've said that before. I hope
we
it's
recorded this in 2031.
Yeah, don't lie. That really confuses people now. But yeah, so we'll get the link in there. Dan can make a note of that one to post that. But we did reach out to the listeners on Twitter, on email, on the Patreon, and ask for their thoughts on this too. So first off, Mikey said, regarding crash retrievals, can we delineate some plausible scenario in which a UFO crash could have been spoofed to mislead a foreign government or spread unrest amongst its people? Could we already have been victims of such a Trojan horse? What do you think, Dan?
I think that's an excellent question. So there's a chapter in Jacques Vallée's Stratagem where he's talking about how the secret keepers kind of kept the secret. And a part of that was to muddy the data, basically. They set up a bunch of watchtowers over an area, and then they staged UFO events, including crashes, so that you'd get all these reports and they could study how people are reacting to, a light in the sky, even though it's fake. And it also means then that the people doing the staging are the only ones who know what the actual UFOs are versus, the man-made kind of fakey stuff. So I think that has probably happened, especially in terms of, distracting countries and giving them something else to worry about at pivotal times. I could imagine scenarios like that happening, during the war or something like that, because they would put up fake tanks and things like that to scare the enemy. And I'd be surprised if it wasn't at least pitched,
Well, look what happened when the original broadcast of War of the Worlds, Orson Welles, went out on radio and people thought it was a genuine broadcast of an alien invasion, and there was a huge panic.
I gotta say, I do think that's a little myth making. There was a little. I think so. There was this story when I was studying film where when they showed the first film, everyone in the cinema kind of ran out the cinema. It was just a train coming towards them in a station, and after a bit of digging, I kind of found that 2 or 3 people panicked, but generally it's a black and white screen and it's flat, and people aren't going to think of that as a real train station and run away. So it's just one of these things that over time I think just kind of blow up. Maybe there were a few people that had a really bad reaction, but generally people weren't in the streets building and looting and things.
No, I don't believe that. I'm going to edit that out to make myself look more correct. But it just shows you though that there are ways that this could have happened. I'm not too sure in terms of UFOs crashing, but what I do think absolutely is plausible is that US, China, Russia have crashed technology deliberately in other countries or out at sea next to vessels of the enemy to deliberately confuse them. Whether it was a prototype they had no intention of doing, whether they've crashed something that allows them to spy a little bit, potentially wanting it to be captured. I would absolutely expect that to happen.
Yeah. And they'd be able to see how, what the protocols were in that country for a recovery of that kind of nature. I think that would be a great technique, and I can see it absolutely being used.
We talked about, was it I forget now because so many things came out at the same time in the summer. Was it the Omaha or the Russell event that was swarmed by UFOs?
Both. It was kind of
both.
The series, USS Raphael. There were a whole bunch of them out there.
So that event, and one of the things that came out about that, which is very plausible, was that if that was the US Navy being swarmed by, for example, Chinese or Russian drones, we always have to use these 3 superpowers, don't we? Then you would just leave them be, because what you're doing, both sides are intelligence gathering. Because if you are the enemy, you want to see how they deal with it, what they've got in terms of stopping you doing what you're doing. Can they, and you, both sides can gather data just off the back of observing, and it's who blinks first.
And those ships go into dark mode as well. So it's almost like they're aware, okay, these could be gathering data, so let's not react properly to this. We'll close down, we'll get our Snoopy team on deck, we'll just watch these things and soak up the intelligence because they want us to react, you know?
Get the Snoopy team on deck and film that aircraft overhead that looks like a triangular UFO. Or not, as it was at the time. We're not going back to that conversation. We're not going back there. We've moved on. UFO Twitter's got enough to fight about. Dave had a question, and something that was, of course, going to come up when discussing crash retrievals. I can hear Joe Murgia somewhere taking note as we speak. Do you believe what Admiral Wilson was told about very little progress being made with the crashed craft, or was this just said to make him stop digging? And the truth is, we have made progress and have advanced craft with military capability. So a bit of back engineering there. Eric Davies says no. Ross Coulthard has suggested maybe. That's very non-committal, isn't it? Eric Davies said definitely not. Ross Coulthard said possibly.
I think we're looking at 2 answers that are very relative there. You know, Eric Davis is this super smart scientist, and when you ask him, you know, we figured it out, he's going to want the complete picture.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when Ross is looking at it, he's thinking, have we figured any of it out? And, you know, those tidbits he gets kind of confirm, you know what, we might have kind of started scratching the surface of this stuff, and we're starting to get to a technological place where we can actually dive deeper. And this kind of brings me to what I think, you know, we talk about gifting a lot and things like that. And I think it's all to do with something that I just call the march of precision. If you look at human history, every single bit of progress, you know, the difference between now and, you know, God knows how long ago, is precision. It's not just fire. It's not just, you know, engines. It's all about how precise we can be. And we've gone from being able to, you know, build really crappy houses to now being able to build quantum computers that use almost the fabric of the universe. You know, we're very, very precise. And if these materials, like they say, are layered bismuth, magnesium, you know, all kind of atomically placed in ways that nature can't do, then I'd say we're kind of getting to the point where we can maybe start thinking about doing that and unlock the deeper secrets of whatever, you know, craft or material we have. You've spoken before about kind of taking certain things from the crash retrievals. So though we might not have figured it all out, they might have had fiber optics in the walls. And we've gone, we've seen that in nature. That's a really cool way of passing light. Okay, let's get that to certain scientists who can put those 2 puzzle pieces together, and voila, it's now out in the world and we're using it. But we're still not as advanced as the aliens, or the visitors, I should say.
So how likely do you think it is that we've got that Independence Day scenario of you can walk into Area 51 and there is just a big alien craft sitting there that, you know, they managed to turn on, and let's forget that they can fly it with a laptop?
So I'm going to change one thing about that scenario, just because, you know, if they found an iPhone 50 years ago, they could use it for about 2 days and then the battery's going to die, right? So I don't necessarily think it's powered on, but I think they might know what it needs it to be powered, and that it's sat there complete. You know, Ross had that great story of craft being found, engine running with the lights on.
Yeah. So
you would just keep it. I mean, I wouldn't turn that off. I would keep that running, and just for as long as it could.
And we talk about again some of these craft, you know, powering them on. Maybe some of them are in a perpetual state of that is just how they exist. It's not a power source potentially for some of them, as we understand it, and you can't turn it on and off. They just exist in that state, and that's when you hear sometimes they talk about maybe some of these craft are potentially almost living entities or machines or mechanisms themselves. You just don't know that that's how something has evolved somewhere to the point that it's almost like a biological machine. And this is something I was thinking about the other day. Just, I'm going to probably butcher this trying to sound halfway intelligent, but just for example, something like photosynthesis, that something biological can take sunlight and grow and get sustenance from it, and can bloom and turn into flowers and everything else. That's an incredible process for something which is literally you can rip up in your hand. You can pull a plant out of the ground and destroy it. So what's to say that somewhere else something else hasn't evolved or developed to the point it's more structured than we understand it, that we would call a machine, but has a lot of the signs of being a living thing?
Yeah, I mean, there's an argument to be made that we are machines, right? I always say when we make the perfect camera, it's going to be like a perfect human eye. We'll kind of need something to be able to record the data, and we might make a warm, mushy quantum computer that we end up calling the brain. But we're essentially machines built by nature. So it makes you wonder, if, say, in 300 years, if we make a craft that thinks, and then we wouldn't think of it as a living thing, right? It would just be a type of biocraft. That would be it. It's the technology we're using. But send it back to now, and we see it as a living thing because we don't understand consciousness. But that's kind of a running theme, that these craft run on consciousness, and that some people with, we'll say, psychic powers, I guess, no other way around it, have been taken into the program to kind of sit in these machines and try and light them up. So it makes me wonder, we talk a lot about consciousness being the fabric of the universe, and people call it 0 point and all these other things. And I wonder if it's just all the same thing, and this is how they run. I thought that was a really good point.
What I'll do is, we mentioned this before we recorded, Dan. Nathan sent in a couple of questions, but we're not going to read those because Nathan is from the Calling All Beings podcast. He's a long time listener to our show and our podcast, and we're going to get Nathan on to discuss that with us for the main pod as well. So that'll be out sometime, hopefully this week or next week. So people keep an eye out for that one. It'll be on the YouTube and available via audio only. But Nathan is a really good guy to chat through this stuff as well. So that'll be a fun conversation.
I've missed Nathan on some of the call-ins as well, so I'm excited to finally meet him and talk properly.
Yeah, he's a good guy. He knows his stuff, and people should check out that conversation on Calling All Beings. James has a question and a point that the Crash Retrievals, is it obvious that these craft and their occupants are always extraterrestrial, or do you think that there's the potential of them being future humans piloting time machines like Ross Coulthart postulated?
Yes, in a nutshell. I mean,
what's more likely though, Dan?
Everything is possible.
Yeah, that's it. With this, we can keep going. Yeah, it could be, and you have to do that. But there also is what's more likely. What do you think personally?
More stars in the universe than neurons, than grains of sand on the beach. Each one of those is going to have, or maybe has a solar system around them. We've already identified planets that are better than Earth for life to develop. I would lean towards the ET kind of hypothesis, but I'm very, very aware that once you get to those speeds, when we're talking warp drives and things like that, we're essentially talking time travel. So the one kind of opens up the other for me.
Yeah. And again, there's the whole understanding of time, and time being, we have a clock and the clocks go forward, and time's a man-made construct. But then, you know what if you could go back? But maybe there's another way to look at time as well, that we just wouldn't understand it as being time. And that's something that people far, far more intelligent than myself get into conversations about. So the kind of stuff you enjoy watching, Dan.
Yeah, I love it. I was just going to say about Tenet, it's really hard to get your head around, but I'd recommend people just search on YouTube for, there are people that kind of break it all down, and you understand the intricacies of it, and it breaks your head a bit, but that's kind of because we experience time in a linear fashion, and I think it's really interesting to try and explore that wider idea.
Like after the 6th time I had watched it, Dan, and still messaged you back and forward, that I think I've got about 70% in the movie now, which I really enjoy it. But yeah, it's a bit of a head mess. A couple more questions from you folks. John Jr., what are your thoughts on gifting? Dan, you mentioned this earlier in regards to Crash Retrievals. Could the Crashes been part of a larger plan to gift humanity with advanced technology?
I think gifting is a really interesting part of the kind of the subtle influence of the phenomena.
Why would it have the intent to do that?
We're talking the intent of the visitors here, so that's anyone's guess really. But for me, I think, and I'm going to use the term raising consciousness here, and I don't mean it in a kind of, you're going to become like Goku and go flying and do energy beams and stuff. I just mean it's going to start making you think in a different way. Before you find a UFO sat there and have that confirmation that you're not alone, we're all pretty, wrapped up in the events of the world, because that's our local area. And we see ourselves a certain way. But then when you find out that you're not alone, you kind of do what Ronald Reagan did and wonder, if these guys came here, would we all suddenly be united as a planet and we'd see ourselves in a completely different way? I think you'd kind of want to develop a species to that point before landing and saying hi, especially if they're as trigger happy as some of the countries here are.
And I think what you've got to again think of, and this is where my mind goes a bit mad in all sorts of directions with this kind of stuff, is if you are one of these species or entities, whether it's dimensional or from other planets or whatever it might be, there has to be an assumed knowledge of our structure and hierarchy in terms of they have world leaders and a military, because you crash a craft, Dan, in a say gifting a craft in a Welsh farmer's field. Why that farmer's field? Is it a case of we will just put it somewhere and they will find it eventually, in terms of either archaeological find, not necessarily right there and then? Would they necessarily have any concept of the danger it might pose to people? We've just heard, as part of the Skinwalker Ranch book that's come out, some of these orbs have flown through people and caused some really serious illnesses. But while that is dangerous and harmful to us as a species, they may not know that that is a consequence, or it might not even register with them.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think that by now they've at least noticed there are a few people scream when they're near. And there have been multiple cases over the past 70, 80 years of people being harmed by this stuff because they get too near to operating craft, or, there are effects afterwards that come with the hitchhiker effects and things like that, and people are mentally damaged. So I think I would agree with you there that they don't quite know what they're doing to us, I think. And we're a little bit, I said this the other week as well, we're a little bit like moths to a flame,
And Dan, you mentioned about, they should recognize people scream when they get near, but then people scream down the front of a Justin Bieber concert. So we're a very confusing species, because, look, they seem very happy. They've paid for this experience, so let's go and abduct them because they scream when we do that. So they must be happy that we're doing it.
There's also an assumption there on my part that they can experience or see the sound waves that we emit when we do that, and they might not. So,
yeah, I mean, when you pull grass out the ground, it might scream or make some kind of noise, but we don't notice it. You just do it. So yeah, poor grass. I can't believe I'm being sympathetic towards grass. One last question. We'll go very quickly before we finish off with a little bit of footage review, which is relevant to this. Hopefully you've all stuck around for this. Again, thanks to everyone in the chat. It's always good to see people getting involved. What will we go with? Okay, so last one. It's a nice one to finish on, I think, and we've kept all the other questions for the main podcast. Dan, if there are, this is from Mark, if there are as many crashes as reported, there must be hundreds or thousands of service members who have been involved at some level. Only a few due-based accounts have ever been told. Why aren't more coming forward? Where are the memoirs or deathbed confessions?
Well, we've had several deathbed confessions, right? But it's hard to kind of verify and follow up when the person's gone. Unfortunately, we had Nat Kobitz from Ross's book recently. There have been plenty in the past, and it's super hard to differentiate. But I'd simply point back to the Manhattan Project. They kept a really tight lid on that until they were ready to reveal it. We've had the same thing happen over the years with things like, stealth bombers being developed. And I have no doubt that there are things being developed that people just don't know. We're going through a bit of a learn in this community as to what classifications there are, what they enable people to access, so on and so forth. And I mean, even at lose level, and we're not talking now, the super black program, secret program that we all suspect exists. We're talking about the one that's now public. Lose classifications were insane. His access was insane. And still he couldn't get access to these special programs. So you got to wonder how long they're buried, what they have to hold over people. And also I think some people will just be attracted to kind of having a secret that no one else has, you know?
Do you not think as well it'd be very easy for many of these teams who deal with this kind of stuff that they would be tasked with, say there were potential, secret space programs, or just generally secret military technology that does go wrong from time to time, that they recover crashed satellites. They would be told it's a secret Chinese satellite. It is some kind of Russian craft that has been downed. Go and collect it, get rid of it. And do you know what? They might have suspicions, but if you're not of the mindset of aliens, UFOs, and spaceships, then they just do what they're told. They clean it up, they put it away. That's it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the questions aren't asked.
We know that other countries have sent debris to Wright-Patterson because that's where the technology kind of research department is. And yeah, I think it was Canada, and it was a down satellite in the end. But it just goes to show that other countries are even feeding America this stuff. America don't even necessarily have to fly out a secret team to gather it.
Yeah. And Dan, a few people asked us to round off. We're asking for each week footage to review. So let us know what you think we should talk about on the pod. We'll share the video. Thanks to everyone who has done that so far. Skinny Bob is one that comes up as a piece of footage that's very controversial. A lot of people think it is CGI or faked, and there are as many people who seem to think it could be genuine. So I'm going to share that now, and we'll have a little look at this piece of footage. Now, I've got it starting kind of round about here. What's your thoughts on the Skinny Bob footage, Dan, that's playing?
My first thoughts is if it's fake, it's really well done. A lot of people have said it's puppets, it's CGI. There are not a lot of analysis by CGI guys you can watch, and there's some really strange frame rate issues with a lot of this footage that lead me to suspect that maybe there's something spliced in here that isn't faked.
Do you think there's the potential that part of this is faked, but some of it's real? And it's that thing that we've mentioned before, that to make something seem dubious, all you have to do is put a little seed of doubt into it.
Yeah.
And a very true story can suddenly become pure nonsense.
Think about what happened with that alien autopsy. There was a big hoo-ha when it was released. Over the years, that person has come forward and said it was nonsense, but that they had a certain frame that they were trying to mimic and kind of get out to the public.
Mm-hmm.
This has been out for ages, and we don't have anything like that for this. It's still a mystery.
It's the stereotypical look that you expect. The big head, the large black kind of gaping holes, almost as we can see in the video, for eyes.
The Steve Jobs turtleneck, because he wasn't from here.
Yeah, it's got the Steve Jobs turtleneck. It's what we kind of come to expect from the Roswell crashes that we hear about, that there were a greys recovered, they had kind of bodysuits on, and there were survivors. And then here we go. Here's footage of what people would expect. Hand on heart, it looks really good. I can't say that it doesn't look a little CGI-esque, but again, I've got to caveat that with my get out of jail card of we don't know what real would look like. And I would really love to get some serious people such as a Louis Elizondo, a Chris Mellon, or others like that, a Jacques Vallée, to sit, look at this footage and go, what do you really think of this? Not that they would know it was genuine or not, but do they think this would be real or not? I would lean towards CGI, but again, I'm no expert in what may or may not be good about this particular piece of footage.
For me, it's kind of how undramatic the footage is as well. Yeah. We're not watching a craft zip-off. We're not watching crazy maneuvers. We're either watching a fake and it's CGI and a dude in a suit, or it's someone and they've made a decision to just not make it very fanciful. I saw a video it was on TikTok the other day, and it was just an interview between two people. And the one person said, "Show us how you blink." And then the woman blinked. And the person said, "No, not that way. Show us the other way." And it turned out that this was what if there was an interview with an alien and then the woman blinked sideways. And it was really undramatic. Just, there wasn't any crazy music or anything like that. And when I watched it, I thought, this is kind of how it would be, but this looks really fake. And I can't get my head around how I deal with it if this was actually put in front of me, I think I'd need someone like Lou to put it in front of me and say, this is real. Sit here until you get that through your head. Because if I saw it on YouTube, I think I'd struggle.
Absolutely. Listen, folks, that's all we've got time for this week on KGRA Digital Broadcasting. You can check out the main podcast available on YouTube now. and also Apple, Spotify, however you listen to podcasts, our interview with Paolo Gizzardi, who is the Italian representative for ICER, International Coalition of Extraterrestrial Research. He also works for the Italian Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Really interesting guy. And he was talking about Project Titan, which is being put forward as a motion to the UN through the vehicle of San Marino, the country. So that was a really interesting chat. A lot of great feedback on that as well. Thanks to everyone who's checked that out. Next week's show on the main podcast should be the full interview you've heard bits of. It's actually a fresh original interview. It's not the same one, with Graeme Rendall. That may be moved to accommodate something else that probably is coming up instead. Graeme won't mind us bumping him by a week, but it's one that is relevant right now to do with a certain book that's come out. So we'll see if that one comes up. That'll be getting priority to go straight out. So yeah, thank you very much for joining us.
Are you getting J.K. Rowling? Is she doing a new Harry Potter book?
No, I hope not, because they milked that for all it was worth. But it's another type of wizard. No, it's not. I can't even say that. People will start to surmise. But thanks to everyone in the chat. Thanks for checking us out. Thanks to KGRA for hosting us. And folks, if you want to go back and watch the archive, you can do so on KGRA. But we're going to start uploading those a week or so delayed on the main YouTube channel as well. So thank you very much for checking us out. Dan, have a good evening.
You too, and thank you to everyone in the chat and for watching.
That is all for this week's show. Thank you very much for listening. Please remember to leave the podcast a review on your chosen platform. You can like, retweet, and subscribe. That would all be very much appreciated. The shows are being uploaded onto YouTube as we speak more and more. You can sign up at patreon.com/That UFO podcast to access the shows ad-free as well. Please get in touch on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, That UFO podcast. Of course, on Twitter, it's at UFO UAPAM. And again, folks, as always, keep looking up. You never know what you might see.
It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer, more like a hubcap designed by Chaucer, a little Baroque and quite steampunk, like Alice was playing bass for the Parliament of Folk. The little fucker hovered right outside of my window, and when I shoved out the screen, he made it an issue. I don't think he expected me to see his ass, but I'd had some champagne and smoked a little grass. Meditative game of state full on meta. I can't imagine how it could have been any better. I got to the top of the stairs and there he was. Like, you awake? I was about to abduct you, cuz. I jumped back and nearly kissed myself, and I climbed out the window after the elf, and I woke up in my bed and there was something on my head and everything was weird and everything was red. And I called out to my boys. They thought this was noise. They thought it was a dream. They thought it was my toys. They thought it was my problems, and they think I should seek therapy, and I don't know what to do because it doesn't really scare me.